Hello and welcome to the Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies, where you can tune into a variety of sessions across the fields of technology, entrepreneurship, and community building. Our session today is around building cross-functional teams. Today we have with us Amelia Schmidt, creative technologist at Clover, and she is going to take a look at the current siloed structures at a lot of organizations and how breaking them down could mean diverse teams, better products, and makes better business sense. Before we begin, I would request all participants to type in any questions that you might have during the presentation, and we will take them up in the last 15 minutes of this session. Also, please don't forget to take the conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us in your tweets using our handle @Srijan and @MealyJane that's up on your screens right now. So, are you ready? Let's dive in. Amelia, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm Amelia. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. It's really an honour to be doing this with Srijan, so I appreciate the opportunity. But let's dive in. So I thought this is kind of how this presentation came about. So my first thought about this was in a conversation with someone about this guy, Steve Jobs, who you probably know. And I was interested in what was he so good at? Like, why is he such a hero and a legend in our industry? Why has he become so important as a figure? And was it because he was a good designer, or was it because he was a good engineer, or was it because he had really good business sense? My thought is that it's actually because he had all three that he was so effective and became such a legend. But day to day, our organizations tend to not be like this. We split our organizations up into silos where we have the engineering team over there and the business people over there and the design people over there. And these silos end up becoming pretty good at their individual methodologies, but kind of suffer, as you probably know, really big communication problems between them, where it seems like they're talking about completely different things. You know, outside of business people seem to be very buzzwordy. Outside of design, designers seem to be snobby, arty people. And outside of engineering, engineers are just incomprehensible. Everything they talk about, no one else understands. So why do we structure our businesses this way? And I guess what I was thinking is, you know, is there some way to start breaking these down and start thinking about these in-between areas where we collaborate together? And on a high level, if we look at the crossover between engineering and design, we're kind of looking at the design of process and the design of delivery, which is things like testing and validation and agile and lean. And then in the crossover between design and business, that little middle section is where we kind of are doing product management and thinking about users and taking that purpose-driven approach. And then in that business and engineering crossover, we see this section of systems thinking where we're applying this kind of top-level view of an entire system that engineers are good at and applying that to business. But right in the center there, in that really sweet middle spot, that's where I think leadership comes from. And I think the visionary figures that we'll be seeing and the people who will be really effective are ones who can really take the best of the methodologies from these three sectors and combine them and synthesize them and really not only just speak the language, but combine ideas to basically drive innovation. The other thing is, if we can speak the same language, we'll just basically bring down conflict. Having shared goals and a shared understanding means that rather than these silos kind of fighting against each other, which is what we see so much and ends up being, you know, a huge problem for organizations that are trying to move faster, we could see more cooperation and more synthesis between those teams. So I kind of felt that, I'd been working in organizations that had experienced massive growth and had seen small teams become, silos that were specialized. And it felt like back at the start, when it was a small team of people working cross-functionally together, we were all on the same page. But as we grew and we siloed, we were suddenly all speaking different languages. And different terms were suddenly, meaning different things to different people because within their silo, that term had a different definition. You've probably experienced that. But once I started to synthesize things and I stepped a little bit outside of that specialization box, I felt like I started to see the matrix, and I realized that everything, these specialized concepts that we use within silos, they often mean the same thing to another silo. Like there is actually a lot of crossover and there's a lot of similar concepts with different names, which ultimately led me to feel like we're all actually still trying to achieve the same thing. But we've kind of given them different names, but the concepts are really transferable. The other thing is I felt like as I kind of became better at my job, which meant expanding my job, I felt like as I was going into different disciplines and training up there, I didn't feel like I was switching career paths forever. I felt like I was just getting more tools to help me innovate and build things, because fundamentally that's what I want to do, is build great products. And whether the tools come from the engineering toolkit or the design toolkit or the business toolkit, I felt like I was just getting more and more different ways to solve problems and build things. And consequently, when I thought back to what it was like to just be fully specialized in only one thing, I felt like it was kind of like just having a hammer and trying to solve every problem with a hammer. So I think this model is proven when you look out into the industry that the most disruptive innovation, the things that are really making waves and changing the way we think, are companies that are really successfully combining tech, design, and business. They're not just design focused and they're not just technology focused. They're these companies that are synthesizing these ideas really beautifully. And I think that is fundamentally how we can be the most effective in this industry and really affect real change. So this talk is basically about looking at these disciplines not as kind of locked off silos, but as sets of tools that you can take and reapply when you need to. So let's get straight into it. The first crossover section that I want to talk about is what business can take from design. So the way this works is I'm going to go through a methodology from one discipline and apply it to a different one. So I want to talk about how you can apply human-centered design to your business model. So you might have heard of this guy recently, Simon Sinek. He is the guy talking about millennials, and he's the guy that talks about this idea of how to start with why. And if you're not up to speed with this, essentially his thesis is that it comes down to the very basics of how a company is structured, whether that company can call itself purpose-driven. And some companies, their business model essentially starts with what, and then expands into how, and then finally they can add the layer of why. But if you want to really be a purpose-driven business, the best way to do that is to really start with your why, start with the purpose of why you started this business, and let the how and what be products of that why. So this is his quote. He says that profit isn't a purpose, it's a result. To have purpose means things we do are of real value to others. I know this sounds very esoteric, but when we look at what we talk about with design, we're kind of talking about designing a business model here, and the same principles of design can actually apply. So this is a very famous quote from Dieter Rams, very famous German designer. He says, good design is innovative. Good design makes the product useful. Good design is aesthetic. Good design makes a product understandable. Good design is unobtrusive. Good design is honest. Good design is long-lasting. Good design is thorough down to the last detail. Good design is environmentally friendly. And good design is as little design as possible. And my idea is that it's really easy for us to just switch out design and turn this into business, because I think all of these values that he's laid out here, they're not just about visual design. They're not just about how a thing looks. They're transferable concepts that we can use to actually make our businesses better. And I know that once you're already in an established business, it's hard to integrate these concepts in and change the fundamental business model once it's already set in place. But in terms of growth, improvement, and even pivoting, it's kind of, I think it's possible to take a design standpoint on how your business works and how your business model works. So when I'm talking about design standpoint, what I'm really talking about is this kind of design thinking process, which is essentially, this is a buzzword now, this is a very popular approach, but it's essentially like what we've always done as designers, but it's really distilled down into its most basic elements. And it starts with, as you can see, this empathy. It starts with this why, where we're learning about the audience for whom you are designing. And in the same way, when you set up a business, it should start with fundamentally learning about what is the target market, what is the demographic, what is the problem area. Once you've done that, you move to a definition stage where you redefine and focus your question based on the insights of the empathy stage. And then the most typical of design process, the ideation stage, where we essentially brainstorm, we come up with solutions, prototype, and then test. And this should kind of be a familiar process for you. But we kind of relegate this to, UX designers sitting in rooms with Post-it notes. And we think about this as a creative process that we give to creative people, but it's actually a massively effective process that can even be applied in business domains. I mean, fundamentally, if you understand people better, it's easy to create relevant value for people. And this leads me to the next UX concept or design concept that we can apply to business, which is prototyping. So this guy, Ash Vora, the author of the Lean Startup, Running Lean, Scaling Lean, he's been hugely influential in the way that I work, and I think that his work really sits across that combination area of design and business. And this is something that I've been working on recently, which is really validating and prototyping on a business model rather than, your idea. So I've seen how this approach is quite challenging to people who come from a more traditional business background, because essentially what we do in this is you draw up your business model. That little diagram is a diagram of the Lean canvas, which he has designed, and is a really great way to map out the underlying assumptions of your business. And then you make a validation plan where you choose the assumptions in that business model which are risky and need to be proven out. And then to prove it out, you construct experiments which help you break down which parts of them are working or not. And if your experiments come back and show that those assumptions are actually wrong, then you can take that back into the business model and adjust. So, for example, one of the assumptions that you could be testing could be, that your clients are willing to pay a certain amount for your service, which is, everyone has to price at some point. So to validate that, you could come up with a small experiment, or as he calls it, a business experiment, to see how much exactly would they pay. So, I mean, this approach is something that we do intuitively anyway, really. You might be charging some clients or customers at a certain amount and some at a different amount, and kind of trying to intuitively figure out what is the right price point. In terms of like a more software as a service model, a business experiment could be just putting up a landing page with a price point and measuring through Google Analytics or a similar tool how many clicks you get on that certain price point, and then A/B testing it, changing the price on a different on certain pages, and then seeing which one gets more clicks. You send paid traffic to it via an ad set, and then you actually get a sense for your demographic, what is the price point that they would pay. So that's one, that's a very simple example around a very simple assumption. Your assumptions could be more complicated, but this approach really is something that doesn't just have to be at the start of a business. Like, as a business matures, assumptions that you may have made at the start of the business may no longer be relevant and may need continuous testing. So the idea of this build, measure, learn cycle is that you continue it until your business model feels like there is nothing that you need to test anymore, which is very, very rare, because as businesses grow and change, fundamentally the assumptions change as well. So this is a little bit more detail about that. You have your documentation in the lean canvas, you identify the riskiest parts, and then you systematically test it. So what about what business can take from engineering? It's a little bit trickier, right? So what about the concept of open source? I found this really fascinating and have wanted to learn more about this. And I guess that's part of what has driven me to start my own company, even if it's very early stages, because I'm interested in these kind of concepts, which seem a little bit more unusual. But let's look at open source. So what open source is, it's software that can be freely used, changed and shared in modified or unmodified form by anyone. So I mean, that's super intense. We can't really say that about, a business model, right? That would be crazy. But if we look a little bit more about into the fundamental principles of open source, it's things like transparency. It's the fact that anyone can get involved and help out. It's the fact that it's self-organizing. There's not, strong hierarchical management structures in open source projects. It's highly collaborative, so it really values people working together, not working on their own. And it's really empowering for everyone involved. Even if you've been involved in the Drupal scene at all, you'll see how amazing it is that even the newest participants in an open source project feel really motivated and empowered to do good work. We can also look at stories from people who have tried to apply this open source model to more business level structures. So this is Erica Baker. She was working at Google. I think she's at Slack now. I'm not sure. She is a blogger. She's on Twitter. She's very vocal about her experience and what she believes in. So this is what she's well known for, is that one Sunday, some former co-workers and I were bored talking about salaries on the internal social network instance, and a spreadsheet was created. So essentially what we're talking about here is an open source spreadsheet where she and her colleagues listed how much they were being paid. And that is the kind of thing that gives managers the heebie-jeebies, right? It really, when you think about it, it really flips you out to think about what that would mean, because fundamentally a lot of traditional business processes are really wrapped up in keeping certain information away from people and making sure that they, don't have access to it, and kind of treating them like, for want of a better word, like slaves. We keep stuff away from employees so they can't get their hands on it because it would be dangerous if they did. And things like, this is one of the most fundamental things that falls into that category, is that, like, it shouldn't be common knowledge how much everyone is paid, because we've been told that that's a terrible idea and that will just cause all sorts of problems. So she's really getting at this assumption, right? She's getting at this assumption that keeping salary information away from other people in an organization is fundamentally the best way to run an organization. And if you look her up and look up this experiment, but basically what happened was it was hugely empowering for her team, and it didn't cause people to flip out and freak out that they were being underpaid. The people who saw that they were being paid less than they wanted suddenly were able to consider their jobs in a different light. Some of them asked for raises, they didn't all get it. Some people saw they were being paid a lot more than their co-workers who they thought were much better than them, and that really gave them a new perspective. And there's been podcasts done about this experiment. There's been many articles written about it. She ended up leaving this position, but other organizations have tried this as well. And overall, what organizations find is that when you execute this well, you create a huge amount of trust between these people who suddenly don't feel like they're slaves anymore. They feel like they're empowered, and they negotiate between themselves how money can be spent, which is really interesting. And it's really like, I'm not saying go and do this right now, but it's interesting to consider that this has been done and has been done effectively in different organizations. Only because it's it's an interesting way of thinking about how we can take some of these closed source things in businesses and make them open source and see what the effect of that would be. So this level of radical transparency, it helps to break down these organizational silos. So it doesn't have to be just money, right? It could be anything. And I always kind of include a Dilbert cartoon because I feel like as I've done more work in this industry, it's become more and more relevant to me. But the first panel says, remember, knowledge is power. This is Dilbert on the table. The middle panel says, so never tell people anything because they might use it to crush you. And the last panel says, do you understand? And the response is, I'm not saying. And this is, obviously a silly cartoon, but at the same time, you can see how it's kind of a microcosm of what we ask of people in organizations. We try to tell them that knowledge is important, hold it to your chest. It's your best way of being successful. So don't share it, keep it to yourself. How many times have you done a project where the most important information has basically been kept from you? Especially as engineers, you've probably experienced this many times. As a UX designer, I've experienced this many times where I've seen really fundamental pieces of the puzzle being kept away from me because for whatever reason the organization doesn't think they can trust me with it, or they don't think that my team can be trusted with it. They think it'll freak us out. So we'll see, like for example, I've seen things like being asked to design features or execute features but not being given enough information about how much time is available or how much money is available. So every decision that we make ends up being a bit of a guess at these like fundamental constraints. And I think the best kind of management is really transparent management where, the managers offer a huge amount of trust. And I think once you start trusting people, they start acting with that knowledge, which helps them actually do better work and makes you naturally trust them more. The other thing is open source principles are inclusive and favor diversity. So we all know how important it is to construct diverse teams. But open source is like the most inclusive method of building anything, because essentially what you say is, the door is open, join if you feel like you have something to contribute. So I was really impressed about how this kind of was being applied at Zendesk. I talked to some people in Zendesk's Melbourne office, and they were telling me that they have essentially an open source hiring policy where rather than new recruits being hired by an individual HR manager or recruiter, the entire team, so they have small cross-functional teams that build little MIDI products at Zendesk, and one of those teams of 7 or more people, every person meets the new recruit, every person is involved in interviewing them, and every person has veto. So if they don't, they basically decide as a team whether they should take this new person into their team, which I think is amazing, because obviously that helps you combat things like bias from one person only judging another person. It helps you make sure that women are involved in the hiring process. It helps you make sure that people from different backgrounds and different different, work backgrounds, but also ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds are involved in hiring someone. So you avoid all of these common missteps that you get when there's just like one recruiter who is one person who has their own set of biases. And I just thought that was amazing. I know that obviously probably would take a lot more time than just having one person doing it. But, as you have probably experienced to some extent, it's hard to hire the right person, but it's even harder to hire the wrong person. So if this approach is successful for them, then I can see why they would continue to do it, because the cost of hiring the wrong person, especially if you're paying extra to a recruiter to do it, can just be exorbitant, and not just in money, but also in time and effort into any of the mistakes they make that could damage your product or your business as a whole. So basically, this is kind of the dichotomy here of closed source and open source. So in closed source, information is hidden from people unless they have the right clearance levels. Silos form because of information hoarding. Organizational inefficiencies cause doubling up, so work gets done twice. It's more political. There's lots of management required. And the old processes become meaningless very quickly. But in an open source business, information is available to anyone who wants to know about it. Teams are all working towards the same goal, which obviously makes silos less relevant. High availability of information leads to increased efficiencies. The teams become highly collaborative and innovative, so obviously you get more good ideas and more groundbreaking work. And the teams are self-managing or managed by processes, so there's less, I'm telling you what to do, and more I'm empowered to know the right way to do it. And the processes themselves are continually updated and iterated on by the team itself. So there's a lot of empowerment and ownership even over these governing principles. So another thing that I think business can take from engineering is systems thinking. So I'm basing this off this website called the Reactive Manifesto, which is really interesting. It's a bit technical, but some of the concepts there really struck chords that I think aren't just for engineers. It's for anyone dealing with a big complex model, which a business is. And the four key concepts are responsiveness, resilience, elasticity, and the ability to be message-driven. So let's talk about what this means. So even though this is an engineering manifesto, this is about constructing engineering systems, these concepts are transferable. So when we're talking about a system being responsive, it says the system responds in a timely manner. So what does that mean for business? I mean, basically what we're looking at is like an agile company that can shift their process to respond to changing market demands. So a company that can adapt and handle change well, they will have an advantage over these slower moving competitors. So this is something that an engineer could apply in a code base, and it's something that a CEO can apply in a boardroom. And this book, Who Moved My Cheese, it's a cliche, but basically what it's trying to instill is not being attached to an idea, and that you can, even if your business model is a certain way, like we said, you can continually validate that business model and challenge the assumptions. And if the validation comes back that those assumptions should be changed, then it's up to the business to be able to accommodate shifting and moving to change, especially to market demands. What about resilience? So resilience, the Reactive Manifesto says, the system stays responsive in the face of failure. Resilience is achieved by replication, containment, isolation, and delegation. So just to take this completely out of context, let's look at like some really different parts of business management. So for example, replication, if we think of something like knowledge management, the resilience comes from being able to capture knowledge from employees. So if they leave, or if they're fired, or if something happens to them, they don't leave this gaping hole that you can't fill anymore. So something like making sure that people are documenting processes, and that you have an LMS or a knowledge management system, a really good way of making sure that the knowledge that's in your employees' heads doesn't disappear with them. What about isolation and containment. So things like remote working and fewer meetings. You've probably experienced when someone comes into work, you don't have a remote work policy, or they feel worried about taking time off, and they come in sick and they take out a whole team or a whole office area. I've seen a sick person come and give the flu to like 30, 40 people, and the business honestly suffered because of it. This is a problem. The business, if that happens, how can the business respond to that kind of failure? So it builds in resilience to be able to say to your employees, if you aren't feeling well, don't come in. Our policy is that, we're going to frown more upon you if you come to work sick because of the risk of that, that offers to our business. And what about delegation? So, this is about hiring people that you really trust, going back to that almost open source framework about this, and about things like 4-minute management. So this idea that like, if people can delegate to each other, then people themselves do not become points of failure for the system if that person has to leave or is fired or something happens to them. So, a manager who can effectively quickly delegate tasks, either take it on or very quickly delegate it to other people, is going to be much more resilient if they can see that they need to do that. So that offers an overall stability for the system. A manager or an employee that hoards tasks and keeps them to themselves and is really bad at delegating to other people, they might feel like they're being very valuable, but actually what they're creating is a point of failure, where if they can't complete the task or do work for whatever reason, suddenly there's a hole and a flaw in the system. Elasticity is a really interesting one. So the idea that the system stays really responsive under a varying workload. So, if we look at a really obvious example of this is Uber's approach to supply and demand fluctuations. So they have surge pricing built into their business model. So they're able to, if we look at, Uber drivers as fundamentally kind of like employees of Uber, they're able to add more employees depending on what the market demands. So the varying workload is really built into how their system functions. And a good example of this is Netflix. They've made it very, very public that they are not too worried about hiring and firing people. Essentially, they don't come at it with kid gloves. In America, the laws are different. It makes it easier for them to do this kind of thing. But they've been very clear that when Netflix gets to a point that they don't need certain people, it's not like a huge offense to that employee if they tell them that their job isn't required anymore. So as the workload increases, and even if that's due to automation, when certain people have to be laid off or moved on, Netflix considers that kind of a badge of honor that, you nailed it, your job is great, there's nothing wrong with you, but this is just how the organization has to be structured at the moment. So it's this really idea of not taking it too personally, which allows them this greater flexibility and elasticity to stay responsive under varying workloads. And then message-driven. So reactive systems rely on asynchronous message passing to establish a boundary between components that ensures loose coupling, isolation, and location transparency. So message-driven systems means that we can really have this this asynchronous communication style. So think Slack and emails rather than conference calls and meetings. So asynchronous messaging doesn't interrupt people's workflows. It enables offsite work, and it helps with accountability. So essentially, like in an engineering system, this would work in a similar way. But if we can make sure that if I send a message via something like a text or a Slack message or an email message, it means that you don't have to be there when I send the message. So that actually allows for greater flexibility within the system as a whole. And I think the move towards embracing something like Slack as a business tool really comes from this understanding that asynchronous message passing actually allows organizations to achieve greater productivity because they're not waiting for people to come into the room to start the meeting, and they're not taking all the people's time at the same time. They're allowed to have some people on and some people off. The other part of the React manifesto that I thought was really relevant is this idea of back pressure. which says that when one component is struggling to keep up, so this is a quote about engineering. It says, when one component is struggling to keep up, the system as a whole needs to respond in a sensible way. It is unacceptable for the component under stress to fail catastrophically or to drop messages in an uncontrolled fashion. So we're talking about, like, this component is really like a piece of code in its original context. But you can see how this idea so naturally applies to the way we think about employees as well, and could easily be transferred to an HR document as an HR policy for a business. So, you know, essentially, like, this idea is that, you know, it's unacceptable for the component under stress to fail catastrophically or to drop messages. So, you know, that means that the business, if that is the core driving principle of the business, that means the business needs to make sure that your employees aren't burning out and flipping out, no matter how, you know, small or irrelevant or low down in the chain of command they are. You know, if one engineer is able to drop out and flip out and, you know, have a nervous breakdown, not come to work for 2 weeks, this concept means that that is a fundamental problem to the business. And it's not about over-hiring engineers so that that one guy doesn't make a difference if he doesn't come in. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about hiring as few engineers as you can, but really making sure that this back pressure idea is held very strongly in the business. So you spend less money because you don't have to hire all those people, but that money that you've saved, you put into this instead, which is essentially creating a system that supports each of the components, and each component becomes an integral part to how the system works. And obviously, you know, this is much easier in a smaller business, and you see this with small teams. So, you know, every person in the team is a hugely important member of the team, but I think transferring this idea, as engineers do, to an entire system means that you end up with a company that is much more efficient and productive than one that has basically over-catered to hiring in a certain area because you don't care about whether certain components fail. We can also look at, essentially, this is the biggest idea of this talk, I guess, is cross-functional teams. So this is something that we talk a lot about in the engineering world. You know, in Agile, cross-functional teams are a fundamental part of Agile. But more and more we're seeing that this kind of thinking is making its way towards the boardroom as well. And Google Design Sprints is a good example of this. So a key feature of the Google Design Sprint methodology is to include at least 7 people from the company from different departments. And if possible, you know, the biggest decision makers in the room, like your CEO. So if you don't know, Google Design Sprints is this way to solve big problems and test new ideas in just 5 days. So it's this high-powered, design-powered sprint that helps businesses solve business problems with design thinking. And, you know, I've seen it used in ways that were just, you know, didn't have enough diverse input from the team, and people didn't come from different departments, and it doesn't work. Like, fundamentally doing this kind of thinking has to involve, it has to involve people from all parts of the company, because it's about tackling these huge problems, like, you know, what is the next product line that we're gonna put out, or are we in the right market, or you know, how can we change our customer service model, things like that. So if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. One thing that I think they talk about in this book is that teams actually solve problems better when they don't all think the same way. And the example that they bring up is the tomato sauce or the tomato ketchup. So depending on where you are in the world, some parts of the world keep their tomato sauce in the fridge, refrigerated, cold, and some parts of the world keep the tomato sauce in the cupboard. And both are fine. The idea, though, is that depending on where you keep it, when that tomato sauce runs out, you then will have different options for how you solve the problem of what do you use in place of tomato sauce. So if you keep tomato sauce in the fridge and tomato sauce runs out, you're probably going to reach for a mayonnaise, or maybe a mustard, or maybe, you know, another refrigerated sauce. And if the tomato sauce is kept in the cupboard and you run out of tomato sauce, you'll probably reach for, a spice powder or a herb or something, a dried herb or something that you keep in the cupboard. And this is essentially a metaphor for how we solve problems that are design problems or business problems or engineering problems, that we reach for different things in our minds. And so you might come up with a different solution to me if you keep your tomato sauce in a different place than I do. And that is essentially saying that people from different backgrounds, whether they're geographic or ethnic or socioeconomic, they bring these different ideas into the room when they solve problems together, which just means that rather than everyone solving the problem in the same way, they have this whole new range of ideas to choose from, which just makes way for so much better work than teams that all think in exactly the same way. So what about what engineering can take from design? This is kind of an interesting question because these teams often work closely together, but we still see conflict, which is really interesting to me. One thing that I've really been interested in is, this idea of usability for your code. So these two guys, Jakob Nielsen and Don Norman of the Nielsen-Norman group, they have, they were kind of some of the original brains behind this whole idea of UX and UX design, and they've created principles that are essentially transferable, like usability heuristics. And usability heuristics, Don Norman wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things, which is about how teapots are designed and how frying pans and doors are designed. Whereas like Jakob Nielsen has more of a background in digital, but the idea is that these design principles aren't just for, interfaces, they're applicable to other things. So I thought, why not think about how we can apply those kind of heuristic principles to code bases? And Joel Spolsky from Trello, and also the CEO of Stack Exchange, he said that it's harder to read code than to write it. And I kind of agree with this, and I think that a lot of engineers would feel the same way, that, when you're writing the code, it's kind of like just getting it out of your head, you already understand it, but going back and even reading your own code can be such a challenging thing. So it's hard to read your own code, let alone read the code of other engineers. So how can we apply these kind of heuristics to the way that we construct code bases? And I think that it's absolutely possible. Things like visibility of system status. So how can you, this is something like setting up an IDE, or like understanding whether your tests are passing as you're writing code, which helps you make sure that you're writing really robust code. Match between system and the real world. So, naming things, naming variables and functions in ways that actually reflect what they actually do. So it's about, this sanity in how you name things and making it really intuitive for other engineers to understand what this chunk of code actually does. User control and freedom. So this is the idea that, that better designed systems allow for people to easily change things. So that would be like making it really obvious what parts of the code are safe to change and what parts are not safe to change. Whether that's with comments or with how you structure your folders or whatever it is. Some of the biggest problems with engineering is just like it not being clear when you get into the code base what is actually safe to touch. Consistency and standards. So that's like really basic things like having a coding standards test, but it could also be things like setting up internal documentation about, what your team is using as best practice. So it's not just kind of Chinese whispers or intuitively done. It's, it's actually it's either coded in as an automated test, or it's documented in a way that is part of your engineer onboarding and potentially even part of your peer review. Error prevention, which is the idea that it's better to prevent errors rather than show error messages, because users have the ability to show errors, to trigger errors all the time. So, how can you, so something like automated tests are something that basically is a simple way of doing that in engineering land. So rather than engineers being able to just pull requests that have catastrophic side effects, make sure those side effects are kind of mitigated by a set of automated tests or end-to-end tests or integration tests that actually check for these important points that you don't want to change. Recognition rather than recall, which is that it's much easier to design something if a user is kind of connecting the dots that you've put in front of them rather than trying to dig into their mind for the last time that they saw it. So you can do things like this could go down to the way that you set up your text editors, but it could also be setting really like going back to the consistency and standards, setting patterns for how things are named. So it's really clear that when you see something that is named in a certain way, what that kind of thing will do. Flexibility and efficiency of use. So this is similar to the user control and freedom, but it's really about that it's being more. It's actually the efficiency thing is quite an important thing. So how can you make it so that it's faster for your engineers to code? How can you engineer and design a code base in a way that makes it so that they're doing more efficient work? So things like I've seen project structure where all of the components kind of dumped into one folder, but I've also experienced how much easier it is to work when each component and its testing and styles are grouped together in its own little folder. So we see like how little changes in the way that we design code bases can make it much more efficient to do work. Aesthetic and minimalist design is, I guess, a flow on to that. Like a really neatly organized code base actually is almost like a more aesthetic code base. It makes it the engineers who are kind of the users of the code base end up in a calmer state of mind because they're not just constantly dealing with this mess of files all over the place. Helping users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So something like we said, having your automated tests built into your PR process. That's really fundamentally about engineers being able to quickly see what's going wrong and fix it. And help and documentation, obviously the easiest way to transfer that is a really good commenting and documentation practice for your code. So really taking these usability heuristics for design and adding them to your code base. So, I mean, the reason why I've thought about this is because I've worked on teams and I know that no engineer is an island. Coding is fundamentally about collaboration. And mostly we get engineers to work in teams because, as we know, more brains make things higher quality. And even if you do work on your own and you are a freelancer or you're the only engineer that your company has employed, one day you might leave or hand over to someone else. So all of these principles are still really important. And, we know intuitively, and I think, obviously not even explicitly, we know that the best code is usually most efficient and elegant, but also the most easily understandable and usable. And we don't really kind of judge code by its, only whether it's really beautiful to look at and whether it's, really elegant and sunny, but also whether you understand it and whether it makes sense and whether the other engineers in your team can work with it quickly. So the next crossover is what engineering can take from business. So flipping it around. One thing that I have seen applied with really great success is taking this idea of the theory of constraints and applying it to engineering workflows. So this is from Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, who wrote The Goal, a very famous business text. But fundamentally, this idea is that even though in any system there can be more than one scarce resource, there is only one scarcest resource. So there are multiple constraints, but there's only one biggest constraint. And when that biggest constraint is freed up, then the next biggest constraint is made visible. But essentially, the idea is that if you fix just any constraint, you might not necessarily be fixing the biggest constraint. And that means that essentially you won't see the flow of throughput increase in the way that you want because you haven't actually fixed the bottleneck. So how I've seen this work is a system that I helped design for an engineering team where we charted out planning, design, development, testing, and we created metrics for each of those stages. So in this example, we had planning was like ideas going into an idea management tool, ProdPad, and then design was essentially going through the UX team through whatever they needed to research and usability testing. Then development was measured by tickets going through ticket management solution, which was Pivotal Tracker, at the time could be Jira or GitHub. And then testing was, tickets getting stuck in automated testing. And so by putting all those numbers up, we were able to create a dashboard of the entire product development process. And that allowed this team to be able to find out where they were blocked and where the inventory was building up. So within this entire team of people, from high-level management and ideas people through to designers, through to engineers, DevOps guys maintaining automated tests, we could sit around with the entire team before this dashboard was created and ask, why do you think we're working slowly at the moment? And the thing is, everyone on the team actually gives you a different answer because it's not clear until you get the numbers. So once we had the numbers and we created the dashboard, we're able to very clearly see where was there too much inventory. And then we were able to prioritize which parts of the workflow needed work in order to get better, consistent throughput. So, for example, the first time that we put this up and we got all the numbers there together, what we saw very quickly was that it wasn't, the UX team that was too slow. What the problem was that, things were failing testing too much. So that meant that not even though it was failing testing, that like they were queuing up at the testing stage, like the testing framework couldn't run everything concurrently. So so everyone, the ideas were good, the design was good, the development was good, but it was getting blocked because we couldn't run enough automated tests. So the way to do that was that, we freed up more throughput in the testing framework, and then more tests were able to go through. And so then that was unblocked. And then the next biggest constraint after that was that there were too many ideas in the backlog. So the UX team switched gears from developing new things to going through and dismissing ideas that weren't possible already to work on. And then that meant that constraint was freed up. And this team just continued to work this way until it seemed like they actually got all of their bottlenecks unblocked. And that was actually an amazing way to look at running a team, and a really effective thing to do. And honestly, not even that hard. Like, you can get the data from the APIs of your ticket management systems. And the added benefit here is obviously that now that you have that data and you have that dashboard, it's not hard to see how that can feed into things like employee KPIs and management KPIs. So yeah, this was kind of where we were. We saw that we had these groups of people or individual people within a team. Their work was being measured. We could see how it was blocked, and then we could unblock it. So what about what design can take from engineering? So what about, we're getting close to the end here, but let's talk about test-driven development. So firstly, let's talk about not test-driven development, which is, you probably know, you've probably done it, even if it's many years ago. You decide to build something, you build that thing, later on you build another thing, and then you break the original thing, and then it's a catastrophe. In test-driven development, you go a different way. You start by deciding to build something, you write a test that fails until you build that thing. Then you build it, the test passes, and then later on, when other things are built, they can't be shipped until that first test passes as well. So you end up building in tests that make sure you don't break things as you develop new things. So we do testing in design, we do usability testing. And, we already are aware that we need to test things, that's very clear. But I find that often we do usability testing quite late into the process, or sometimes there's kind of an added bonus to validate something that you already know is true. We could look at switching this around to do something like test-driven design, where we use usability tests, analytics, or measurements as a form of benchmarking that becomes a prerequisite for any design task. So this is how I like to work, is I basically focus on the measurement to better judge whether my solution is actually fixing something. So, for example, I could say, you know, if someone asked you to design a new homepage, I could just get started and design a new homepage, right? But what I actually want to do is have almost like a suite of usability tests that I can check to make sure that all these things are still possible. So check that someone can order a product, check that someone can log in, check that, you know, and I can do these tests with real people. And if one of those tests seems to be failing or not working very well, that's how I know I need to improve on that area. And I continue doing this kind of suite of usability tests after we develop a feature, putting it in front of people and making sure that we haven't accidentally made something else worse. One of my favorite concepts that I think is important to apply to the world of design is simple made easy, which is from this guy, Rich Hickey, who is the creator of Closure, getting a little bit into functional land here. And his idea is that there's actually a subtle difference between simple and easy. He's an engineer, and he, you know, simple comes from simplex, which is the opposite of complex. And that the definition of simple that he offers is it's one role, one task, one concept, and one dimension. It's not interleaved or interwoven with other things, and it can be split out and used on its own. Whereas easy is kind of versus hard, and it's more like it's near or it's at hand. You know, it's on the hard drive, it's in the tool set. It's also near to our understanding and skill set, so it's familiar and it's near our capabilities. And in terms, this is his slide, in terms of development speed, we can see that if we emphasize ease first, we get really early speed, but we ignore the complexity that builds up, and then over time we slow down. Whereas starting simple, it's probably slower at the start, but it speeds up over time, which is actually better for a business or an engineering project or a designer overall, right? We don't want to start fast and then end up drowning in complexity. So the way I see this is like, why would you do a pattern library approach when you could do, you know, a big, complicated, many-layered Photoshop document? And for me, the pattern library is really the simple approach where, yes, it's harder to do it at the start, it's slower, you deliver less, but what you end up is you end up with more speed accumulating as the project continues, and you need to build pages out faster. Whereas you probably can build a page faster with this single Photoshop design at the start, but over time it becomes harder and harder to actually build pages because you haven't built a scalable set of components that you can rearrange. So if we look at the easy approach, Photoshop, why is it easy? It's easy because, I've done it this way before. I have Photoshop on my computer. The stakeholders all like PhDs. I can't communicate my ideas as easily in style guides, or I don't know how to code. Whereas the simple approach, a pattern library approach, design time is focused on components which are reusable rather than once-off PhDs. The design effort pays off over time. The consistency increases across the whole project, and the team is empowered to do things without getting blocked at that design stage. So, it's almost like the Photoshop way is the lazy way, but the pattern library way is the smart way, that even though it's slow and doesn't give you that instant gratification, it is actually a smarter decision overall. Dijkstra says that simplicity is the prerequisite for reliability as well, and I think that that's true, that a pattern library approach is going to be a much more reliable design approach than just one-off PSDs that are hand-coded every time. So what can design take from business as that last bit? So I think part of it is this jobs to be done methodology, which I'm really interested in at the moment. It's from Clayton Christensen, who is the guy who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, and he's from Harvard Business School. He's one of the world's top management thinkers, and this is a marketing methodology that has since been kind of co-opted by product design teams, and it's basically the idea that customers don't simply buy products, they hire them to do jobs. And he explains this through this video where he talks about working with a fast food company to improve their milkshakes. And basically, to completely summarize it, and you should definitely watch his retelling of this, a fast food company came to his team and said, we want to be able to make better milkshakes? How do we do it? And they tried, they'd been trying to improve the milkshakes. They'd make it more sweet or more toppings or, better looking or different containers. But none of those things were working. They weren't getting more customers to buy milkshakes. So what they did instead was they decided, well, what we need to find out is like, what job do customers hire milkshakes to do for them? And he kind of talks about how once they found out what that job was, it was very clear how they needed to improve the milkshake to make that milkshake sell more milkshakes, because it was better satisfying the needs of the customer. And this is something that we're now taking into the user experience design world to like really, when we get to these features that need improvement, understanding exactly how we can improve it rather than kind of shooting in the dark and just making it prettier or faster or whatever it is. Really like focusing in on exactly what it is that we can improve and having the most impact with the smallest amount of work. So the idea is that once you know what job your customers hire your product to do, it's easy to understand how to improve them. And this kind of comes down to something you probably understand from the way that I'm speaking, is that I really think that design is more than just about making pretty pictures. It's about understanding the competition. It's about shaping the roadmap. It's about designing things that engineers can actually build. It's about evaluating those designs in real-time usage. And it's, most importantly, it's about throwing away ideas that won't work. It's about designing the thing right, but also designing the right thing. And something that I think this is a great one towards the end is the 25-5 rule. I like to use this in my life as well. It's actually from Warren Buffett, the most businessy business guy of all. He's one of the most successful investors in the world. And he gave this advice to someone. He said, list 25 things that you want to achieve and choose your top 5 of those 25 things. So, do whatever you want to do, whether these are like design concepts or life concepts or whatever. You write all of them out and then you circle the top 5. And then he says, never ever think about the other 20 ever again, because basically every moment that you spend thinking about these other 20 things will detract from you achieving the top 5. And I think that for designers, this is this trade-off between what to do now and what to do later, which can be really overwhelming and really hard. Like, how do you prioritize different design tasks? And I think what we end up with when we follow this idea through is minimalism, and it's not subtraction for the sake of subtraction, but it's subtraction for the sake of focus. And that when we take out, if designers need to take out these distracting other 20 intentions and 20 design ideas and really focus on the smallest amount of design ideas possible, but not, continuously entertain the other ones as well, but really figure out how to keep that focus. So, and as I said, I think that this is something that you can even apply to your own life if you want to, but it's really a matter of really being ruthless about what you say you're not going to do. So whether you're a designer or an engineer or a manager or, something else, I'm trying to do this talk because I think that leaders who build great businesses will actually have the tools of all 3 of these disciplines, and they'll be able to pick and choose whatever tool is most appropriate to the situation. So here's that quote again, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. And I think that, understanding these different methodologies from different disciplines allows us to be much more adept at solving problems, no matter what specialization you're currently in. So I think it's up to you, it's up to all of us to start growing our toolkits and branching out and seeing whether we can take concepts and ideas from other disciplines and applying them to the work that we're doing now. Because I think you're going to need more than a hammer to build something that will change the world. That's it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. The slides are available. There'll be lots to Google. So I think we can take some questions quickly.
Thank you so much, Amelia. That was a really great session filled with a lot of great ideas, and I'm sure all our listeners would be willing to go back and try to implement a lot of these and try to enhance their toolkit and get more than a hammer to solve their problems, as you said. So I'd like to ask all our listeners that if you have any questions, now would be the time to type them in. And I do have a couple of questions here with me that have come in, which I'm going to quickly take it up with Amelia. So first up, you are talking about what a lot of different departments can learn from each other. So you said what we can learn from each other, but could you also throw some light on in the present context, or if you're building a product or service, how important does it become that we break down their silos?
That's a really good question. I think that it really depends on what kind of organization you're in. I think, even though I've spoken a lot about the importance of cross-functional teams, sometimes silos can be effective. I personally think that, if you're in an established business and you do have these big silos, you have to weigh up the effort of what it means to dismantle those silos and how much that's going to cost the organization, not just in money but in effort, and in potentially losing staff as well. I think that the best implementation of this idea comes from an organization that hasn't just done it because they've seen that it's a cool thing. It's something that's really woven into the direction and the mission of the organization. So I think that it's important, but I don't think it's something that can be taken lightly. I think it's something that really has to be part of the blood of the organization. It really has to be something that is meaningful and not just done in a token way.
All right. So the next question that I have here is that do you think when now that we have so much more technology or so much more different ways to communicate and collaborate at our disposal, do you think now it's easier for us to get across or cross the boundaries of our department and collaborate than it was before, and that is why the silos came up in the first place, because there was less number of ways to maybe collaborate with each other?
Yes, definitely. I think that is totally true. I think that as technology is moving forward, we're actually making it easier to work together. And you see this all the time, like the fact that we're even doing this webinar now is like a good example of that we're, constantly looking at, there's so much innovation, even just around, how to make organizations work better together. And I think that, yes, it's probably true that silos are kind of a relic of a time where it was harder to collaborate for whatever reasons. And also that, to some extent, like the way that, we're trying to work remotely, we're trying to make sure, people in different countries can work together. I think that has happened because we've broken down silos and we've developed new ways of working together, but also the demand for that has pushed demand for new ways of working together as well. So we've created kind of a push and pull system where these kind of different forces are working together. And I think that it's up to organizations to figure out whether they're being pulled by a demand for employees to work in different ways, or whether they're going to be the leaders and open up different ways of working and see how that changes the way people work within their organization.
All right. Also, I think the next question that has just come in is that so do you think in an organization which is trying to implement this kind of thinking, which is trying to get into place cross-functional teams, how important does the agile methodology become in such a context? I mean, mostly it's the developers who are using agile in order to get their projects, the sprints, the scrum, and all of the other philosophies that they use. But in terms of building cross-functional teams, how important does agile become? You touched upon it a bit in your presentation, but could you just maybe expand on it a little bit?
So I've seen agile work, with just essentially engineers and product people, and I've seen that be okay, and I've seen it work with other stakeholders involved, and I've seen it absolutely be an incredible process that just changes things so quickly and can deliver such amazing results. And I mean, if you've been in agile teams, you probably know that you just get so much benefit from having stakeholders involved in some of those important agile meetings, that, you know, you see very quickly how different things are once you get the right people in the room working with you on different projects. And it doesn't mean that like every person has to be involved in every project or like every department even. It just means that the idea of agile provides these concepts that we can easily put into different, you know, non-software contexts. Things like having a stand-up meeting in the morning, or having a retro meeting. I have a retro meeting with my partner, like as part of our relationship, because the whole concept of, you know, a retro allows people to have this kind of safe space to reflect on whether something is going well or not. And that's the kind of thing that I think that Agile does really well. As an organizational methodology, it provides like a psychological safe space for people who are working in it. And it also really empowers those people to manage themselves and step up and be part of a team rather than expect to be told what to do. And I think those things are absolutely valuable for non-software teams and should be picked up by other teams as soon as possible. And, you know, I'm privileged to work in a startup where the two founders, the head of marketing, the mathematician, the software designers, and the engineers all stand around in the morning and are part of scrums, and then we all come together and do retros at the end of the week, and we all work on refining the backlog. And I've seen how amazing that is and how powerful it is as a process.
Alright, so I think we have time for just one last question before we wrap up the session. So this one's, if we are to, or if our listeners, let's say, or if even me, if we are to get this cross-functional thing and learning from different departments, that kind of culture going on in our organization, how much of, how do you ensure that everybody else in the organization buys into the concept, or, buys into that idea?
Yeah, so getting buy-in is always the hardest part in any process. You know, even when I'm doing design thinking workshops and things like that, getting buy-in is pretty much the challenge. Again, like, it's hard to give advice on this because depending on how, you know, the culture is at your organization, what I suggest may or may not work. But from my background as a user experience designer, the best way to get buy-in is to show them how it works and prove it. So the best way to prove this is to bring it in and facilitate it and get the people to actually see how successful it is and how empowering it is. And that requires, you know, a bit of strategy from your side, you know, as a person or a team who's trying to bring this in. But you can't kind of just ask people to read about this and be theoretical about it. You have to start proving that it's effective. And it's really up to you to be able to prove that.
So it's more like one successful small-scale experiment to just, demonstrate how
exactly
this would be, and then get it.
Exactly. So it's like a validation experiment. You create a prototype. You do something that is like low risk that allows people to see the value, and then from that you can start, continually adding more experiments in or more prototypes in that allow, your stakeholders that need to be brought into the process to understand the value. But do it in a way that's kind of experimental or low risk, so you can document results and measure success each time.
Alright, so I think with that one actionable idea, we are ready to, close the session for today. And it's been like a lot of information and a lot of new ideas, and I'm pretty sure all our listeners are going to just raring to go back and try them. So thank you, Amelia, for joining us today and taking us through this wonderful string of ideas. And thank you all our listeners also for being such patient listeners, and to Amelia for patiently answering all our questions. So before we go, I would like to inform that our next webinar is on the 8th of March, and it's going to be about decoupled Drupal and all the advancements that has happened in the in the quadruple in the past couple of months. So with that, and I really hope to see all our listeners at our next webinar. And with that, I think that's the end of our session today. Once again, thank you, audience, and thank you, Amelia, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.